Welcome back to American Freedom and American Slavery. This is part two of the lecture, detailing the arrival and growth and investment now in a whole new system of unfree labor, that of enslaved African laborers in the New World working in every corner of colonial society, particularly in the cash crop, agricultural, plantation districts, and seeing a corresponding shift in what I'm calling America's cultural geography. That is, a cultural shift toward a system of unfreedom based on race, lifetime hereditary enslaved status. In other words, what we call American slavery. And you see the map here of the Chesapeake Bay region showing colonial Virginia and Maryland principally, where enslavement took its deepest roots in the harvesting in particular of the cash crop of tobacco. Although we will see beyond the Tidewater from New England to Georgia, also the arrival of enslaved peoples for the purposes of laboring in what was now the growing English colonial system. And once again, we see this most clearly, I think, in the legal codes passed by the colonies. In Virginia, a new law stated that all non-Christian servants brought into the colony were slaves for life. This was a law in the late 1600s. Slaves for life. And so the mask is pulled away here. This is no longer going to be a form of indentured servitude or something, some sort of hybrid, but would now be lifetime hereditary unfreedom. And by the 1700s, Africans represented 40% of the population in the Chesapeake Bay region. So a substantial growth in numbers following the redefinition of unfreedom toward the lines of slavery. It was as if once that line had been crossed, there was no barrier any longer toward the free importation of enslaved people, which invested slave owners, of course, now with an enormous new power, the power over life and death itself, which led to a cruel and coercive system of punishments and physical threats that was simply avowed to be necessary for the continued maintenance of this system. William Byrd of Virginia, perhaps the wealthiest slave owner, among the wealthiest slave owners of his day, wrote that an unhappy effect of owning many Negroes is the necessity of being severe. Numbers make them insolent, and then foul means must do what fair will not. Justifying punishments, often grievous punishments, justifying them on the basis of discipline and order and the compulsion to work, which had its effect not only on master and slave, but even on non-slaveholding whites. That is, this culture of enslavement, this culture of violence and oppression will do its part in determining the attitudes even of non-slaveholding whites toward enslaved people. A Virginia law in 1680 prescribed 30 lashes on the back, the bare back, and it specified that, of any black slave who threatened any white person. And later laws made interracial marriage and interracial sex illegal. According to one Virginia planter, blacks, quote, blow up the pride and ruin the industry of our white people who, seeing a rank of poor creatures below them, detest work for fear it should make them like slaves. So even non-slaveholding whites took a certain superior air, a certain haughty air toward those who were enslaved, as if they were standing on a platform above them and thus elevated in their own right in society. What will later famously be called a mudsill even the poorest white could feel a sense of superiority to an enslaved black person. And the defining of race now, that is color, as a badge of status was almost unavoidable. It contributed, as one historian said, to the metastasizing of slavery. In other words, the influence of slavery will now spread beyond the slave quarters, beyond the plantations, across colonial society to affect even the thoughts of whites. Along with growing numbers of enslaved Africans, fewer English servants in the tobacco fields combine with fewer free African Americans to make skin color a legal and cultural dividing line between free and slave. According to one Virginia planter, these two words, Negro and slave, have by custom grown homogeneous and convertible. It was at this point that in the American mind, I think, the metastasizing of race, that is, the idea that color corresponded to enslavement, takes root, and not just among slave owners, as I say, or even among slaves, but among non-slave owning whites as well. It simply became a commonplace to see darker-skinned people enslaved, and thus the two conditions seem to join together in the minds of many, one justifying the other. Even the status of free blacks was tied now to the anchor of enslavement. In Virginia, free blacks lost the right to bear arms, hold office, vote, and employ white servants. In 1723, Virginia's governor called for the, quote, perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from that great privilege of a free man, to teach them that a distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of an Englishman, with whom they never were to be accounted equal. This reminds me a bit of the Costa paintings that we talked about in discussion board 1. As many of you pointed out in your discussion posts, the Costa paintings seem to create a kind of ladder of racial preference, a hierarchy of authority and cultural prestige based on color. And so now also in the English colonies was a similar kind of hierarchy established, with the basic dividing line being that of color, and color being assumed the natural condition for those who were enslaved, or that slavery be the natural condition of those of color. It seemed interchangeable. But even for free people of color then, life below that line was just naturally assumed by whites to be the natural condition. So again, the birth of what we would call racism is tied directly to the material conditions arising out of the laboring needs of the English colonies. Of course, to position oneself in a society either above or below others, was ultimately to invite retaliation or conflict. And so we see the phenomenon of slave rebellions becoming now a part of that cultural geography. South Carolina in September 9th of 1739 was during the harvest time. As an epidemic of malaria raged, a band of slaves marched down the road, burning plantations, gathering followers as they continued to walk south before their uprising was crushed. What came to be known as the Stono Rebellion of 1739 prompted many colonies to adopt strict so-called black codes, transforming the social system of slavery into one of legal racial oppression. To this day in Carolina, historical markers bear witness to the Stono Rebellion. These were slaves who essentially rose up in the rice plantation districts of the seacoast, rose up, overthrew their overseers, joined together. There were relatively few whites living in the plantation districts of Carolina because of the problem of malaria. Whites preferred to live in Charleston, in the relative material comfort and confines of Charleston. So down in the plantation districts of the lowlands, there was relatively little supervision over the slave labor force. And sure enough, in 1739, when the Stoner Rebellion broke out, the worst nightmare, if you will, of the white slave owner was realized. Armed slaves on the march, killing and attacking anyone who resisted, particularly white overseers and others who managed the plantations. But as the sign here points out, sparing others. It seems the rebels were trying to make their way to Spanish Florida, where they believed they could become free under Spanish law, even though slavery existed in New Spain as well. They hoped to join up with other so-called maroon communities, that is, communities of fugitive slaves that had taken up residence in Spanish Florida and had lived basically outside the reach of Spanish authority. And though most of the so-called Stoner rebels were eventually captured or killed by the white militias that organized in response, some few Stoner rebels did make it to Spanish Florida and later on as far as Cuba, where they attempted to live and work as free people of color, even though, once again, on the Spanish sugar island of Cuba, slavery was also encoded. So it was a difficult prospect to find a safe haven outside the reach of enslavement. Running away offered no sure hope. Rebellion offered no sure hope. And so one might say that one's chances were narrowed considerably by the almost universal reach now of enslavement. Yet, excuse me, for some, slavery's status also meant a privilege. And one mark of greatness was the owning of slaves. That is, the status and prestige that went with being a slave owner. Something that accrued to one by virtue of one's wealth and authority and position. Again, William Byrd of Virginia, I have my flocks and my herds, my bondmen and bondwomen, so that I live in a kind of independence on everyone but Providence. So the invoking of Providence, or God's will, as a mark of humility by this slave owner, who otherwise was much like a god in his own right, the lord of a manor, you might say, a plantation manor, in which his authority included the authority of life and death, but a kind of romanticizing here, rather than the emphasis on the strict punishments and risks of slavery, depicting himself as a kind of English manor lord upon whom his natural family and extended slave family depended for their sustenance and material well-being. So yeah, a lot to puff up the ego here, a lot to puff up the kind of cultural status of this new cultural geography. An American-born elite of families, white, plantation-owning, slave-owning families, raised to see freedom and slavery as perfectly natural components of daily life. Here's a portrait of a colonial Virginia family showing the elder son with bow and arrow, having learned to hunt, bringing home a prized bird as his dog sits by, his bird dog who hunts with him. This was part and parcel of growing up a young man in the slave-owning South, was to exhibit these martial qualities, these abilities, these skills as manor lords. You learn to ride, you learn to shoot, you learn to hunt, and even to war. And this, again, sort of equips you with the status and prestige of being one who could command not only an army, but also an army of slaves, that is, a laboring force of slaves. And you see the younger brother, the younger sibling, coming out to greet his brother, being ushered out by the female house slave with whom he has been raised now to see as part of his own extended family. So what we're getting here is a picture of status and cultural prestige among the wealthy, among the landowning, the slave-owning, gentry elite that represent a kind of New World aristocracy. If not literally aristocracy, then a kind of pretended aristocracy that has slavery organically embedded into its very image. Beyond the plantations, slavery was integral to the daily business of New World cities as well. It wasn't only the plantations. A few years back, this Associated Press article detailing the slaves' role in the creation of New York. We said before that New Amsterdam, as a Dutch colony, was literally built by the labor of slaves. Slaves who continued to live and work in the colony when it became New York. From this article, the African labor force was crucial to the prosperity of Dutch colonized New Amsterdam in the 1600s and later New York. In 1776, there was about 25,000 people living in New York, about one-fifth of them slaves. They worked on docks and made roads or did farm work and domestic work. The skilled artisans and craftsmen were associated with shipping, construction, and various trades. So not plantation labor, but city life. The city trades, the city labors, domestic work. All of this was part of the fabric of even the colonial urban cultures, the port towns, the port cities, New York, Philadelphia, even Boston and New England. To some extent, were all connected to that larger market of slave trading and West Indian imports that seemed to bring the metastasizing of slavery to the corners, the far reaches of the colonies. In a basic way, you might say, the vaunted freedom of white Americans, that which later American revolutionaries will tout as sufficient cause for revolution, that cherished freedom, that liberty of white Americans was built on the foundation of slavery, and the unfreedom of black Americans, along with the historically constructed, the culturally constructed idea of race. Prestige for one meant enslavement for another. Liberty for one meant denial of freedom for another. And it was that ironic tragedy that allowed free whites so much freedom as to enshrine it in the very constitutional expressions of the later days. The written laws, the charters for governments, the political foundations on which the country would be built, the we the people idea of American democracy, inextricably tied to a sense of separation from and elevation over the unfree peoples whose labor was indispensable to the literal construction of these colonies. So yes, American freedom, American slavery, the intertwinement of contradictory ideals that form the foundation stone of what will become the United States. So that's it for now with part 2. Have a good week, everyone.